Okay, so William and Catherine have left Windsor, and the reason underneath that sentence is the strangest thing I have gone through in a long time. There is no feud in this one. Nobody leaked an email. Nobody froze on a balcony. None of the usual royal machinery is turning here. This story is unsettling for a different reason. It is the kind of story that makes you think about your own house at 2:00 in the morning. It started with a structural inspection at Adelaide Cottage, the small house on the Windsor estate that William and Catherine chose for themselves so their children could grow up with grass and doors and something close to an ordinary childhood. Engineers went in with clipboards and instruments to look at the foundations, ordinary work on an old building. 17 minutes later that evening stopped being ordinary. Underneath that cottage runs a network of passages older than the cottage itself. Some of it goes back to the Civil War. Every survey missed it. Every security sweep missed it. Every official record of that property going back decades had nothing on it at all, and the tunnels were the smallest part of this. Sources close to the investigation suggest the tunnels alone would have been a maintenance problem and a weekend of paperwork. The thing that emptied that house at midnight was what the engineers found inside them. And I am going to hold that back for a few minutes because if I hand it to you right now, you will file it as a spooky detail and move on. Stay with me and you will hear it the way that family heard it. Now, the timeline. A Tuesday in late November, roughly 1:45 p.m. William and Catherine had gone up about 3 hours earlier. George, Charlotte, and Louis were asleep. The infrared sensors sitting inside the walls of Adelaide Cottage registered movement in a place where nothing should have been moving. William woke first. That tracks with the man. Years of military training rewired his sleep, and the small change in air pressure as protection officers started working through the lower corridors was enough to pull him up out of it. Catherine woke seconds behind him, the way mothers do. Neither of them said anything. Two people who have lived their whole adult lives under observation learn early that in the first minute of a crisis, listening tells you more than asking. The knock came soft, and it did not stop. William crossed the room in 4 strides and opened the door on Marcus Headley, the head of their personal protection, standing in the dim hallway with a face that had already delivered the message before he opened his mouth. 3 more officers held positions behind him in the corridor. Nobody was going to send this family back to bed with a reassurance. Headley told them that the structural engineers had found evidence of recent human activity in the spaces under the house. Not a century ago, not 50 years ago. Recent and repeated. Tools with no rust on them, footprints in dust that had not settled, empty water bottles with purchase dates from the previous month, a folding chair, clean, a thermal blanket, and photographs. Photographs of the Wales family going about an ordinary day. Taken from angles that told you the person holding the camera knew their schedule. Somebody had been sitting underneath that house while the family slept above it, and that person had been doing it for a while. Headley put it to William in 5 words, and sources close to that corridor say William repeated them back to his wife exactly as he heard them. They were under the house. Under the house. Not at the gate, not over the wall, not in the trees with a long lens like every other person who has ever tried to get near that family. Under the floor of the room where his children sleep. Hold that thought, because you now know what they found in the dirt. You still do not know who put it there, and you still do not know how long he had been down there. That second answer is the one that emptied Windsor, and I owe it to you before the end. Catherine was already moving toward the children's rooms before Headley finished the briefing. That detail is the one that stays with me. She did not wait for the rest of it. She did not ask a single follow-up question. The moment she understood that the question on the table was her children's safety, she was in the corridor. George, Charlotte, and Louis had to be woken gently, dressed fast, and moved somewhere secure while investigators worked out the size of what was sitting under their bedrooms. Catherine has built a public image out of calm. In that hallway, the calm slipped about a centimeter, and behind it stood the woman who makes every decision in that family through one filter, which is what happens to those 3 children. William stood in the doorway watching her move from bed to bed. Her voice stayed low, and even while she explained to 3 confused children that they were going on an adventure in the middle of the night, George, 11 years old, already understands that his family comes with complications other families never meet. Charlotte, 9 and sharper than anybody gives her credit for, asked the question that cut straight through the story her mother was building. "Are we safe here, Mommy?" Catherine paused. Half a second, no more. William saw it from the doorway, and he understood exactly what that half-second cost her. The evacuation itself ran clean. Security teams rehearse these scenarios constantly. and hoped to die of old age without ever using them. William carried Louis down the stairs, 6 years old and still half asleep against his father's shoulder. Catherine came behind with a hand on each of the older children. Staff had already pulled the essential bags from the lists that get updated 4 times a year and stored where nobody has to go looking for them at midnight, which tells you something about the level of preparation sitting under the surface of that family's ordinary life. 3 vehicles waited on the drive with engines running and routes already agreed. And this is the picture I keep coming back to. A woman standing on her own gravel drive in the November cold, coat pulled over what she went to bed in, one of her son's shoes in her hand because it came off on the stairs, smiling down at 3 frightened children so that they would not panic. Grown men in earpieces standing around her in the dark, the Princess of Wales on her own doorstep being moved out of her own home by strangers with torches. Catherine turned for one last look before she got into the car. That house had been a decision. She and William chose Adelaide Cottage on purpose over grander options, so their children would have gardens instead of galleries and bedrooms instead of exhibits. They moved the whole family there in 2022, and every paper in Britain reported it at the time as the 2 of them buying their children a slightly more normal childhood. Now it stood behind her in the dark with its warm windows, and it had turned into something she did not recognize. William's hand found hers. And I keep thinking about the man carrying the 6-year-old down those stairs, because there is another woman in this story who used to carry 2 small boys through the middle of the night. Diana did it to get her sons out of a palace and into the real world for an hour, down to a burger place, into a car with no crest on the door, anywhere the job could not find them. Her son was carrying his own boy through the dark for the opposite reason. Same staircase feeling, same 2 arms, and the job had found him anyway. The motorcade pulled out at 43 minutes past midnight and left behind a property that was already turning into 3 things at once: a crime scene, an archaeological site, and a security failure that somebody was going to have to explain to the king, to the government, and eventually in some carefully sanded down version to the rest of us. By dawn, there were white forensic tents standing on the lawns at Adelaide Cottage, each one sitting over an entrance to the network underneath. Detective Chief Inspector Sarah Wright got the call at midnight and came in for 2 reasons: her record on historical property crime and a clearance level that let her work inside the strange rules that govern anything involving that family. Her team went in with ground-penetrating radar and thermal imaging. If you have never come across it, ground-penetrating radar is the equipment surveyors use to see voids under solid ground without digging, and it is the reason this whole thing unraveled in a single night instead of a decade. The map they built was worse than anybody expected. The passages did not stop at Adelaide Cottage. They ran on and connected to Windsor Castle itself and to 4 other properties on the estate, Frogmore Cottage and Royal Lodge among them. Sit with that for a second. For years, and possibly for a great deal longer than years, there was a way of moving around the Windsor estate that went underneath every gate, every checkpoint, every camera, and every system built by people who spend their careers thinking about how somebody might get to the royal family. And not one person on the payroll knew it was there. The tunnels themselves could be dealt with. Old Stone does not attack anybody. Seal the entrances, censor the rest, close the file. The reason this turned from an infrastructure headache into a national security incident was the evidence that somebody had been using them over and over, and recently. In one chamber, sitting directly beneath the room where Prince Lou sleeps 20 feet above, investigators found a camp. Somebody had set himself up down there with a chair and a blanket and enough water to stay a while. And more photographs, not archive images, not history. Recent pictures of that family living their lives, and the selection told you what the person taking them cared about. The school run, Catherine's morning route across the estate. The narrow window each day when protection changes shift and the ground goes quieter than it does at any other hour. Nobody wanders into that pattern by accident. That is somebody doing homework. I want to put one thing next to another here because I do not think you can talk about this family in photographs without it. William has spent his entire life being photographed by men whose faces he never saw. He was 15 years old in September 1997 in a dark suit walking behind his mother's coffin through central London while the world took pictures of him doing it. He learned before he could drive that a camera pointed at his family is not a neutral object. 28 years later, a man was lying in the dirt under his son's bedroom with a lens learning the times of day when nobody was watching. William took updates every hour through that first day. He and Catherine had taken the children to Kensington Palace, and I doubt either of them missed the joke in that since the entire point of Windsor was to get the children out of a palace and into a house. They sat in the apartment that used to be home and tried to explain to 3 sets of questioning eyes why nobody was going back yet. The investigation moved at the speed that anything touching that family moves, and at the same time it had to crawl because half of what came out of the ground had historical value. Every object had to be photographed, logged, and assessed twice. Once for what it meant to counter terrorism and once for what it meant to the archive. Dr. Helena Ashworth from the Royal Collection Trust found herself working shoulder to shoulder with counterterrorism officers, and her knowledge of Tudor and Stuart building work turned into the most useful thing in the tent because she was the only person in the building who could explain how those passages had stayed off every modern plan. By the middle of the afternoon, they had a rough picture. The network is older than Adelaide Cottage by a long way, at least the 1600s and probably earlier. Parts of it show wear from the Second World War when Windsor was hardened against a German invasion that never came, and 2 young princesses called Elizabeth and Margaret spent the Blitz behind those walls, and then somewhere in the decades after, the knowledge went. Not destroyed, misfilled, box-shelved, cataloged under the wrong heading. Forgotten by the last person who ever had a reason to look at it. Royal property archives are enormous, and nobody has ever finished reading them. The question hanging over every officer in those tents by evening was the same question Charlotte had asked her mother in the dark. Somebody had found those tunnels again. Somebody had gone to the trouble of getting equipment down there and staying. That man had a reason, and until the investigators had his name, they had no way of knowing what the reason was. King Charles took his briefing at Clarence House. In front of staff, he held his face still. On the phone to his son shortly afterwards, sources suggest he did not bother. And I understand the reaction because Charles has lived through the whole catalog. In 1982, a man called Michael Fagan walked into Buckingham Palace, got as far as his mother's bedroom, and sat on the end of her bed while she talked to him and waited for somebody to come. That story is a matter of public record, and it has haunted royal security planning for 40 years. More recently, as the BBC reported, a man named Jaswant Singh Chahal climbed in the grounds of Windsor Castle on Christmas Day in 2021 carrying a crossbow, and the Old Bailey sentenced him in October 2023. Both of those men came over the wall. Everything the palace has built since is designed around people coming over the wall. This one came from underneath, and that is why the king's voice changed. There is a second reason it landed on Charles the way it did, and it has a name. The last time this family lost control of who was pointing a camera at them, it ended in a tunnel in Paris in August 1997 and a funeral at Westminster Abbey on the 6th of September. Charles walked behind that coffin with 2 boys who were 15 and 12. 30 years on, his son rings him at midnight to say that a stranger has been photographing his grandchildren from a hole in the ground. Nobody in that phone call had to say her name. In that family, they never do. By that evening, MI5 had joined the investigation, which gave the team resources no protection unit carries on its own. Agents started the slow work of pulling 6 months of security footage and looking for the same face turning up too often, the same car parked too long in a place with a clean line of sight to Adelaide Cottage. The digital forensics people went at the photographs from the chamber, stripping metadata, identifying the camera, building a profile of a man who had put serious time and serious money into watching a family he had never met. And I'm going to hold one thing back here a little longer because the forensics team already had it by that first evening, and it took another 2 days to reach the family. If I give it to you now, it is a number, and you will hear it as a number. Wait, and you will hear it the way Catherine heard it in a briefing room with a cup of tea going cold in front of her. Catherine spent that day trying to hold the shape of an ordinary day around 3 children who knew perfectly well that nothing was ordinary. George's questions got sharper as the hours went on. He knows enough about how his own security works to know the difference between a burst pipe and an evacuation, and he had already worked out that nobody evacuates a house at midnight over a burst pipe. William found his elder son standing at a window looking out over Kensington Gardens with his shoulders squared, and the posture went through him like a wire because he had seen that photograph of himself. The conversation between the 2 of them was short and it was honest. William decided years ago that he would not repeat the emotional distance he grew up inside, that his children would be able to bring him a question or a fear without having to book it through anybody. That promise got tested in a corridor at Kensington Palace by an 11-year-old who wanted to know whether the man was still out there. Diana is the reason that promise exists at all. She was the one who told her sons things straight, who let them see the parts of the world the household would rather have kept off the schedule, who decided that a boy is better served by the truth than by a polite version of it. William has said as much about her in public in his own words more than once. And in that corridor, he had to work out how much of the truth an 11-year-old can hold when the truth is that a stranger had been lying under his bed for 2 winters. His mother never had to answer that particular question. He did. I'm going to leave the two of them at that window for a moment because the next thing the investigators pulled out of the ground is what turns this from a break-in into something I still find hard to say out loud. Last week, I covered Princess Anne taking down Camilla to avenge Diana, and how that one move stunned the whole country, William included. A lot of you came into the comments underneath it saying the same thing, that the real story with this family is never the row you can see. This video is that comment answered because the row you can see is a row. The thing you cannot see is a man in the dark with a camera and 2 years of patience. Day 3 brought the material that turned this from a security incident into something closer to a case study in what obsession does to a clever man. The recovery teams pulled documents out of the tunnels stored in waterproof containers by somebody who cared about keeping them dry. Maps from different centuries marked up, cross-referenced, annotated in a hand that got smaller and tighter as the pages went on. That is not the work of a man taking pictures of a princess. That is the work of a man chasing something. Professor James Harrington, a historian who has spent his career on royal properties and the architecture nobody puts on the public plans, came in to read the documents and tell the police what they were looking at. He came out of that room bothered in a way that archive work does not usually manage. The annotations pointed at treasure, specifically the idea that royals hid valuables underground during the Civil War to keep them away from Parliament, and that some of it never came back up. Jewels and gold sitting under Windsor for nearly 400 years waiting for the right man with the right map. That theory lives on the internet. It does not live in any archive Harrington has ever worked in, and the person who wrote those notes had stopped being a researcher some time ago and turned into a believer. William sat across a table from Detective Chief Inspector Wright while she took him through the profile as it stood. The intruder, and by then nobody was using a softer word, knew how to read historical documents. He had access to survey equipment that costs real money. He had the patience to run surveillance above ground and exploration below it over a long period without ever tripping anything. And then Wright got to the part that changed the temperature in the room. Deeper in the system, in chambers you reach by crawling through gaps barely wide enough for a grown man, the search teams found older camps, not last month, not last year. Items dating back close to 2 years, 2 winters, 2 Christmases in that house with the tree in the window, 2 summers with 3 children running in and out of the garden. And underneath all of it, a man lying in the dark writing in a notebook. The journals came up in bad condition and went straight to the transcribers. The handwriting gets harder to read as the volumes go on, and that deterioration on the page maps neatly onto the man's descent into the ground, which is the detail Harrington said he will not be forgetting. Catherine's reaction to each new briefing was the controlled fury of a mother who has just learned that the one boundary she thought she still had was never there. She made her peace with the loss of privacy a long time ago. The cameras at every engagement, the opinions about her clothes, the strangers with theories about how she raises her children. All of that she absorbed as the price of the life she married into. This was different in kind. A man had been underneath her sleeping children for 2 years, watching, waiting, and planning something that nobody had yet been able to name. And the decision about going home stopped being a decision about locks. Every room in the house would need sweeping for devices. The whole property would need the kind of upgrade that turns a home into an installation. The exact quality that made Adelaide Cottage the right choice, its modesty, its ordinariness, its position among trees rather than behind walls, had turned into the reason it could not protect anybody. Nobody has said out loud what Catherine was thinking when she was told about the 2 years. Watch what she does next, though, because she never set foot in that house again as a resident. Charles called a meeting at Buckingham Palace and put security chiefs, government officials, and the senior household in one room. Those meetings are usually exercises in mutual reassurance. This one was blunt because the question on the table went well past one cottage. If the ground under Windsor had been forgotten and then used, what is sitting under the rest of it? The Tower of London stands on medieval foundations. Hampton Court has Tudor bones. Buckingham Palace itself has been built, half demolished, and rebuilt so many times that nobody alive has seen a complete plan of what runs beneath it. Then came the part every royal security discussion ends up at, which is the press. Reporters had already noticed that the Wales family was not at Adelaide Cottage, that the school run had changed shape, that something was happening at Windsor behind a screen of white tents. Somebody had to decide how much of the truth could go out without handing a manual to the next man with a theory and a shovel. William and Catherine sat together that evening at Kensington Palace after the children finally went down, and they said the thing to each other that they had been walking around for 3 days. They had chosen a smaller house to give their children a bigger life. That choice had a cost neither of them had costed. Nobody blamed anybody in that conversation. They both know that every decision about how to raise those 3 comes with a trade, and that some trades only show you the bill years later. By this point, the investigation had a face. Footage analysis kept returning one man, somewhere in his late 40s, appearing near Adelaide Cottage often enough that no analyst was going to call it coincidence. His vehicle led them to a rented cottage 3 miles from Windsor. Officers arrived to find it empty and left in a hurry. He had known. Somehow, within hours of the discovery, that man knew his tunnels had been opened and he was gone. The manhunt that followed used resources normally reserved for terrorism cases, and the logic behind that is simple. He knew royal properties. He had surveillance equipment. He had spent 2 years underground pursuing something nobody had yet identified, theft, harm, or something that does not have a clean name. The not knowing was reason enough to put everything into finding him. And now I owe you the thing I held back at the start, which is who he was. The break came from a place that says a great deal about how this kind of obsession works now. A moderator on an online forum about royal history flagged a run of posts that had been worrying him for a year and a half. The account posted under the name Windsor Truth Seeker detailed theories about treasure under royal property, maps. Maps that looked very much like the annotated pages sitting in an evidence room in Berkshire. Dr. Miranda Foster, a psychologist who works on obsessive behavior and on the one-sided attachments people form with public figures, went through the digital footprint. The progression she found is the same progression she has seen in this work for 20 years. Interest becomes study. Study becomes theory. Theory becomes grievance. And somewhere along that line, the writer stops being a man reading about the royal family and starts being the main character of a story in which the royal family is hiding something from him personally. The name came out of the archives in the end, the same way the tunnels did. Malcolm Hendricks, 47 years old, formerly a curator at a small historical society in Kent. His colleagues had watched him get stranger for a year before the society let him go, 3 years before any of this. After that, he had no job to go to, and he gave the whole day, every day, to royal properties. He was good at it. That is the part that makes him dangerous rather than sad. He could read a 17th century architectural plan. He knew how to work an archive without leaving a trail. He had the training to find a door that fell off the records 400 years ago, and he had nothing else in his life to think about. Somewhere in all that solitude, he crossed a line. He came to believe that the Wales family was standing between him and a discovery that would restore his name and prove that the museum had wronged him. 3 children asleep in a cottage turned into an obstacle in a story he was telling himself underground. The journals confirmed it once the transcribers got through them. Hendricks was spending 8 and 10 hours at a time down there. He wrote about preferring it. The dark suited him, the silence suited him, and he felt closer to the history he was hunting than he ever had in a reading room. The entries about the family start as observation times, routines, weather, then they change. He starts writing about them the way you write about people you know, and the man had never spoken a word to any of them. Foster's assessment used the term parasocial once, and then dropped it because the plain version is stronger. He had built relationships in his head with a woman and 3 children who did not know he existed, and he built them out of photographs he took through a lens from a place they could not see. William read that assessment and understood the shape of the problem straight away. Sensors do not fix this. Cameras do not fix this. A man who gave 2 years of his life to being underneath your house is not a man who reads about the police finding his camp and goes back to normal life. Hendricks was still out there. He is the reason the rest of this story goes the way it goes. Catherine had the hardest conversation of her years as a mother in the days after that. George had picked up enough from half-heard adult sentences to know that somebody had been watching them, that the somebody had been under the house, and that nobody had caught him yet. She had to find a version of the truth that an 11-year-old could carry without it following him into every dark room for the rest of his childhood. I do not think there is a good version of that conversation. There is only the one where you tell your son the truth and then stay in the room. The upgrades at Adelaide Cottage went in fast. Nobody simply bricked up the entrances. Every one of them got sensors that fire on the smallest disturbance. The grounds got more cameras, facial recognition, monitoring equipment that would make the same approach almost impossible for the next man, all of it necessary. All of it correct, and every single addition took the house one more step away from being the reason they moved there. Meanwhile, the investigation widened again, because somebody had to ask whether Hendricks was alone. The forums he lived on turned out to be a world most people never see. Whole communities built on theories about that family, and inside them a habit of encouraging each other one step further across every line. All in the name of a truth that exists nowhere except in the thread. The children carried it in their own ways. And this is the part I find hardest to talk about lightly. Louis had nightmares about monsters in the ground. He is 6. His mind took a midnight evacuation and produced the only story that fits at that age. And Catherine sat with him night after night explaining that the ground is just ground. Charlotte went the other way. She started checking doors, then checking them again. A 9-year-old walking a house at bedtime confirming that the windows are shut is a small thing to watch and a very large thing to carry, and her mother watched her do it. George went quiet and started watching his parents' faces for the worry they were working hard to keep off them. By the 3rd week, the family had arrived somewhere that no security upgrade could reach. Even with Hendricks Court, even with every entrance sealed and every room swept, Adelaide Cottage had changed in their heads. The house had done nothing. The rooms were the same rooms. The garden was the same garden. The kitchen, where Catherine had made a mess of more than one birthday cake, was exactly as she left it. The knowledge is what ruined it. 2 years of a man lying under the floor while the family slept above him, and no amount of concrete puts that back in the box. William and Catherine started talking about alternatives, and both of them found the conversation humiliating in a way they did not say out loud. A different property on the estate, one without 400 years of forgotten stonework underneath it. Kensington Palace full-time, giving up space and quiet for the security that comes with a building somebody has watched continuously since before either of them was born. Something else that had not shown itself yet. The decision, when it came, went out in the language of infrastructure. A strategic relocation while comprehensive works are carried out at Adelaide Cottage. Both of them understood the translation. They were being moved out of their own home by a man neither of them had ever met. The morning they left, it rained. Gray, flat November rain, the kind that gets into a day and stays. And here is the second thing this story did to that family, because until that minute it belonged to them. The statement went to the press that afternoon, worded to give the public enough to satisfy the question without handing anybody a map. The Prince and Princess of Wales are relocating their primary residence to allow for comprehensive infrastructure and security work at Adelaide Cottage, expected to take several months. By evening, it was everywhere. Front pages, rolling coverage, photographers standing in the rain at the Windsor gates filming an empty drive. Every outlet in Britain running the same footage of white tents on a lawn and reading the same 11 bland words about infrastructure to an audience that knew perfectly well nobody moves 3 children out of a house in November over infrastructure. Members of the public came and stood at the gates with flowers, which is what this country does when it does not know what else to do. And the pictures of those flowers ran next to the pictures of the tents. A family that had chosen that house to get away from exactly this ended up watching their private disaster become the 10 clots of news. And the commentary started within the hour, because it always does. People who have never stood on that drive explaining to a 9-year-old why she has to put her shoes on at midnight had opinions about whether the security had been adequate, whether the move to Windsor had been a mistake in the first place, whether the whole thing was being oversold. Panels, columns, former officers with charts. 3 days of the country turning the worst night of that family's year into an afternoon segment. Catherine watched some of it. Sources close to her say she stopped watching on the second day after a presenter used the word overreaction about the decision to carry her son out of his own bedroom. The children had been prepared over the previous days in versions matched to their ages. George understood the most and asked about the investigation with a precision that told his parents where his mind had been going at night. Charlotte made her peace with the move faster than anybody expected, and that resilience is going to serve her for the rest of her life. Louis, 6 and still able to accept almost anything as long as his parents looked steady, wanted to know which toys were coming and whether the new place had a garden. Catherine walked through Adelaide Cottage on her own before she left with the protection team, keeping their distance in the way they have learned to. Every room had something in it. The kitchen, where she attempted the elaborate birthday cakes and produced the ordinary weeknight dinners, and found in that the one part of her life that connects her to every other mother in the country. The sitting room, where film night turned into a family institution. The bedrooms, where 3 babies turned into 3 people with opinions. None of it was erased. All of it was tainted, and she knows the difference. William did his own walk and did it like an engineer. The works going in were necessary, and he had signed off on all of them. He also understood that they were going to change what the place is. Adelaide Cottage will come out of this safer and more monitored than it has ever been. And it will feel like everywhere else they have ever lived. Whether either of them will ever want to walk back through that door is a question neither of them put into words. The move ran like an operation, staff and security getting the family's life across London with as little disruption to 3 school timetables as possible. Kensington Palace was familiar ground, the London base all through the Windsor years. Now it had to be the house, which is a different job for a building and a different adjustment for the people inside it. Charles came to see them on the 3rd evening. Private dinner, no diary entry, and by every account a conversation about family and security and the impossible business of keeping anything ordinary while living the way they live. He spoke from a long experience of adjusting his own life around threats, and he told them what he has learned, which is that every generation gets its own version of the same problem. The hunt for Hendricks kept going and kept coming up empty. Nationwide alert, public appeal, nothing. He had planned for the possibility of being found the way he planned everything else. The rented cottage told them more than he would have wanted. Research going well past Windsor, detailed work on Sandringham and Balmoral, which reads as a man who was not finished. Foster updated her assessment with a line that put a chill through the investigation, which is that isolation plus obsession plus a public humiliation, and having his tunnels taken off him counts as one, tends to push a person from watching toward doing. The weeks after the move showed the family the size of the bill. George got more serious. He started asking about protocol, about how his own protection works, and every question was a boy realizing that this is his whole life and not an incident. Charlotte stopped wanting to sleep alone. Catherine sat with her until she went under, night after night, and did not once suggest that she was too old for it. Louis adjusted fastest the way 6-year-olds do, and every so often he asked when they were going back to our real house. Neither of his parents could answer him. Catherine found herself grieving something bigger than a building. Adelaide Cottage was a plan. It was the answer to a question she and William asked themselves before George was born, which was whether it is possible to raise royal children with any part of a normal childhood intact. That plan now looked naive to her, and the guilt that came with it made no sense and would not leave, which is how guilt works in mothers. William carried his own version, sharpened by the thing he cannot change. He will be king. His family will always be the target of somebody's obsession, and no amount of care in how he raises them alters that arithmetic. He has spent his adult life trying to build something that holds duty and fatherhood in the same house, and a man with a folding chair in the dark made the whole attempt look thin. By late December, there was a shape to the days again. The children settled into new routines. The schools took their briefings. William and Catherine went back to public duties with the practiced calm that gets mistaken for coldness by people who have never had to do it. Adelaide Cottage sat empty at Windsor while contractors worked on it, officially on the infrastructure, and unofficially on a problem that no contractor can fix, and that is the thing about their sanctuary being taken. The tunnels can be sealed, the sensors can go in. Every technical measure on the list can be signed off and paid for. The knowledge stays. Somebody was down there in the dark, under the floor, while 3 children slept, and the man who put him there is still walking around Britain with maps of Sandringham in his head. On Christmas Eve, with the children asleep and the palace quiet, William and Catherine stood at a window looking out over Kensington Gardens and talked the way parents talk when they finally get 20 minutes. The year ending, the children, the spring, and where they will be living in it. Neither of them said the obvious thing, which is that Adelaide Cottage is probably finished for them. Not lost to a threat anybody could name, lost to knowing. Diana used to take her boys out at night to see London when nobody expected it because she wanted them to have 1 hour that belonged to them instead of to the country. She spent her life being followed by men with cameras, and she died with a camera pointed at the car. Her son bought a small house with a garden so that his own children would never learn what that feels like, and a man with a lens took it from him from underneath. Malcolm Hendricks never got his treasure. There is nothing under Windsor except old stone and water, and there never was. He gave up his career, 2 years of his life, and whatever was left of his mind chasing gold that does not exist, and the only thing he successfully removed from that estate was a family's belief that they were safe in their own beds. He is out there tonight, somewhere still convinced that he is the hero of it. That is what he is. A man who took 3 children's home away and found nothing. Hit subscribe if this is your kind of thing.